Welcome to the Future of Wellness, exploring self-transformation and holistic healing to unlock your inner potential. Hosted by Christabel Armston and Keith Parker.
Welcome to this episode of the Future of Wellness podcast. Today we're joined by Ian White. Ian is an author, fifth-generation Australian herbalist, and founder of the Australian Bush Flower Essences. He graduated from the University of New South Wales with a Bachelor of Science before completing degrees in naturopathy, herbal medicine, and homeopathy, and has been practicing successfully as a naturopath for over 45 years. Growing up as a young boy in the bush, he would spend as much time as possible helping his grandmother make herbal tinctures and extracts. Having developed a profound respect and connection to nature, Ian has continued this family tradition. Specializing in the emotional and spiritual qualities of the Australian bush, he has spent over 40 years of intensive research pioneering his range of 70 Australian bush flower essences. He's the author of 5 books and regularly teaches seminars and workshops throughout the world. Ian, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting with you both.
Yeah. So, we just heard in your bio that you've spent decades exploring the healing power of specifically Australian bush plants. And we heard some in the bio there, but we were hoping you could build on that story, maybe stuff with your grandmother or things that are relevant to you so that the audience can learn a bit more about you and, kind of how you got into what you do today.
Certainly. Well, for anyone who's listening who might be into Sydney, I grew up in an area, it's about an hour from there now. My parents' property backed onto National Park, and my grandmother lived next door. You could either go down a dirt road to her place or clamber down a cliff. And as a young boy, I had much more fun hanging out with her than going to school. So my dad would leave work early. He was a pharmacist, but also used herbs. And my mum was a softer touch, so I'd be doubled up in pain, pleading with her that I wanted to go to school. She said, "Oh no, I think you're far too sick. You better spend the day with your grandmother." And once I'd realised that mum had left for work, we would spend an enjoyable day going bushwalking. I'd help her make up tinctures and extracts, etc. And then my mum would come home and she'd go down to pick me up, and she'd ask my grandmother, how was Ian? And she said, "Oh, gradually he got better during the day." So I think she enjoyed my company as well. And I think it was from her that I got an appreciation. And in the bush, there are all these plants with very strong healing qualities. Unfortunately, she was a very heavy smoker and she was riddled with cancer even before I was born, but she kept it at bay with a number of native plants, but also Phyta lacca, which I'm sure a lot of listeners from North America would know that plant, and a few other elder. And, unfortunately, she died when I was about 9. A lot of the knowledge that she had, and she along with my great-grandmother, was some of the first white people looking at medicinal properties of Australian plants. And, for the second time, that knowledge was lost, because when the first white settlers came, they brought in influenza, smallpox, that really decimated a lot of the indigenous people, and theirs was an oral tradition. So I've got a few books left from my great-grandmother and grandmother where they're talking about some of the plants and some of the recipes and formulations, but a lot of that knowledge was lost. So it was a bit of a shame. But I went on, I was doing university, got very sick traveling in India. So I started to rebuild my health with herbs and yoga, Tai Chi. And then I tried to combine natural therapies with my degree. And by the time I got to the end, I realized the thing I was really passionate about was more the natural remedies. And, I was mainly a homeopath, but I enjoyed reading about flower essences and English Dr. Edward Bach, and I thought, that's great, anyone can use them. And I thought, strange, no one was working with some of the Australian plants because of my experience with my grandmother. And then I had a good friend who was early 30s. He was diagnosed with bowel cancer. He asked me if I'd hold a healing circle for him with all our mutual friends the day before they're going to operate. And, he was charismatic, successful in all areas, last person you'd think with a serious illness. So we did that, and the healing circle, and the next day they operated, and my friend who'd been brought up on an organic farm, had cancer everywhere, and they said there's nothing they can do for him. So I kept those healing circles every week. Shortly after he died, about 6 months later, in the meditations, I started getting pictures of plants, told where to go and make them up and what their qualities were. And they're very specific, like some areas I said, you have to make it here. And I thought, I've never seen that flower there. And I'd go there and there was masses of it there. And I was already, my practice was already going. So I had the opportunity to see the results, remedies I'd make up during the morning. I could use them on patients that afternoon. So the synchronicity showed I was on track, but also, I could see the results. And they worked very quickly. I was used to using the bark flowers 4 times a day for a month. My patients still sometimes weren't sure what was happening, where the Australian ones was morning and night for 2 weeks, and people really could notice quite a lot of change. So, that was 40 years ago now, and then the research has continued.
You mentioned there the Bach flower remedies of the English tradition. And of course, we have actually previously interviewed a flower essence specialist working with North American flowers and environment. But some people listening may be unfamiliar with the concept of flower essences, and I wonder, or vibrational essences as well. Could you explain from your perspective how they're working on the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical level, and maybe a little bit as part of that about the energetic, of course?
Sure. And, I might give a little bit of background. I mean, they've been used for thousands of years. Most cultures have a history of working with the flowers to treat emotional states. The Egyptians have got the oldest records going back on papyrus, and it's about 3,000 years. In Europe, the earliest person was Hildegard von Bingen, who left written records, and she's a Catholic saint. In the 12th century, ran a monastery, had all the nuns would lay muslin sheets out over the flowers overnight, which would absorb the dew. Next morning, they'd collect the sheets, wring them out, and that dew was used to treat emotional problems. And, in Australia, Aborigines, when the first white settlers came, they noticed if they were sick, they would float, especially the waratah, in water, and they would drink the water, or they would eat the flowers, getting not just nutrition, but also the vibrational quality. So when you take a remedy, it comes in liquid form, it goes under your tongue, goes into the bloodstream, from the bloodstream to the digestive system, and then out into the nervous system. And in the nervous system, it branches out to what we refer to as the meridians, those energy portals in the body. And silica in our body is an amplifier, same as quartz crystals they use in radios. It amplifies out the frequency of the radio waves. So silica, which is in our hair, our nails, etc., acts as an amplifier and beams that vibrational quality of the essence out from the physical body into the subtle bodies. And we have 6 subtle bodies around the physical. So, if we think of, the Kirlian photography, you cut a leaf, you can still see the full shape of it. That's the etheric body. And then we have, mental and emotional and 2 astral and causal bodies. So the vibrational quality goes out into the subtle bodies, and that's where we store different emotions. Like if we have healers, and someone could see auras, they'd notice usually it's a beautiful green in the aura. If someone's full of jealousy, it's a pretty murky green, for example. So those emotions will stay in our subtle bodies. But if you're jealous for a very long period of time, gradually that will filter back into the physical body. So then you'll have problems, say, with the gallbladder. And so what the essences are doing, by going out initially, they'd be dealing with that emotional state, such as the jealousy. But also, if you've had that jealousy and you've developed, say, a gallbladder problem, it can come back in on the physical. But because it's treating the cause, it's very effective, not just treating the symptoms. And we had an Australian Prime Minister, the equivalent, I suppose, of the US President, and he was removed from office while he was the Prime Minister by his political party. And he had a reputation for being quite an angry, impatient character. And there's shots of him 2 days later back in the Parliament, and you could feel the rage coming out of him. Like it seemed like coming out of every pore. And then we heard reports that he was whipped off to the hospital a day later for emergency service surgery to remove his gallbladder. So again, like in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, they say that 90% conservatively of our physical symptoms stem from those emotional imbalances. So with the flower essences, we can treat the physical, but we've also going back and treating the trigger, the cause behind them.
I want to just grok onto something you mentioned about how you got into doing this, because I was really curious. And you said that you did these healing ceremonies and you received these pieces of information, were shown certain flowers, told what to do with them, etc. I'm curious how you contextualize how those messages came to you. And in part, I'm wondering, how might it fit in potentially with the indigenous traditions of Australia and their kind of famous psychic abilities, these things like song lines, the dream, the power of collective dreaming within those communities, and their kind of what we might call psychic attenuation to one another. So I'm just wondering, how did you contextualize those messages that came to you?
I think if people are comfortable with past life, and if you're not, you can see it as genetic memory being passed down the family tree. Seems like most of the exploring that aspect of my past, I mean, a lot of times working as a herbalist, there's been, times being out in the bush, being an indigenous person. So, my understanding is we have spiritual guides who are helping us in our work, depending on what you're doing. And that can change if your career changes into a very different area. So some of the guides that I have got that herbal tradition, connect my connections to them back in that era, or indigenous ones. So my understanding is a lot of that knowledge of information was being channeled through to my higher self from that spiritual guidance around me. And for me, I've been meditating for like 50 years, but it's normally gut feeling, intuition. So to get very clear visual pictures was very different and was quite exciting. Doesn't happen for anything else. And so, that's my understanding. Also, when I'm out in the bush, if I'm making a remedy, and I will call in a lot of the spiritual beings of that area and the nature spirits, the Davic realm, and it's communicating directly with the plant. So, I can think of that guidance, but also directly from the sort of that Davic kingdom, passing on that information. And sometimes I had the sense that when I'm making an essence, the plant said, oh, finally, someone's aware of this gift that I'm bringing to humanity. And I think, every flower has some healing quality. Some will express it more fully than others. Like in bush around, where I live, there are 3 plants I know dealing with fear. But the one that I work with, called dog rose, is far more specific and more encompassing than the other 2. So every plant has some healing quality. And it's also waiting to when it's the appropriate time. Like when I was out in the bush with my grandmother one day, we came across this flower called Sydney rose. It's in a Boronia, and any aromatherapist might know of the brown Boronia from the west coast of Australia. Very beautiful scent. The Sydney rose is much sweeter, and it was so popular that back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it used to grow in the very central part of Sydney. People would all pick it. And my grandmother hadn't seen it in the bush for quite a long time. She thought it had been, extinct. And we came across this clump of it, and she was so excited. And I was about 4 at the time. So I went back later that afternoon by myself and picked all the flower that I could find to give to my mother. And it just so happened that my grandmother was coming for dinner that particular night. And she came in, my mum's at the stove chopping, it was a bit noisy. And I could see my grandmother come in, and she saw all the Sydney rose in the bowls and the vases. And then she glared at me, and she was always very kind. I'd never seen her so angry. She didn't say anything. She said to my mother, where did they come from? And my mum just heard the flower. Oh, aren't they beautiful, chopping away? Yeah, Ian got them for me. She glared back at me. So I was really convinced that this would be one of the first of the essences coming through, but it didn't come in until 15 years later. And it was just before the new millennium, I was out in the bush and I'd been making an essence that day. I was making my way back to the car, and there was as if you talking to me, Keith, and this voice said, it's time, it has to be made today. And I was turned startled. I didn't see anyone in the bush, and I'm looking around, and it was actually in Sydney Rose. 3 times I've had a plant audibly communicate, once in Findhorn and once in north of our country. But this was the longest conversation, and I made that essence of the Sydney Rose. But again, it's the plants are choosing when it's appropriate for them. So it's not so much, I'm bored, I've got nothing to do, there's nothing on Netflix, I think I'll go and make an essence. It's like really waiting till the plant comes through and that particular timing. It's like when our consciousness is ready for it. And I think when I first started making the essences, they were dealing with more basic things like grief, sadness, anger, self-esteem. But as the time has come through, they're dealing with far more spiritual aspects. And I think that's, the evolution of our consciousness. And as the essences come down, they really help to take us to that next level, or help us balance what's going on. Like Bach was doing his work in the 1930s, nearly 100 years ago. Society was so totally different. I mean, there was no computers, there was no internet, there was, the pace of life so different. And there was no radiation from nuclear sources. We have one essence, grows in the center of Australia, that when I first, the first information I got for it was for fear of fire or hot objects. And I'm thinking, at that time I was told there'd be 50 remedies. And I thought, great, I'll have 49 wonderful ones, and this one will be a bit of a dud. And then it's not just heat, it's also solar radiation, so sunburn, skin cancer, but it's also releasing electromagnetic nuclear radiation as well. In fact, there's an organization called Green Cross. It's an offshoot from Red Cross. They're looking at environmental factors. And after Chernobyl was destroyed in 86, they started doing work in Belarus, which was the worst affected country. The wind blew most of the radiation to that country. And, even 15 years after Chernobyl, they're finding children who are born, maybe 5 or 6 years later, they're still impacted because it's now in the water table, for example. So every year they go around monitoring children, and the worst affected ones with the highest level of nuclear radiation are taken into the Alps in the summer, and they try different modalities, different treatments to try and reduce the radiation. And the murmula, which is the flower I work with, it reduced the nuclear radiation by 43% in 2 weeks. The next best treatment they'd ever had was 24%. Now, why didn't a plant like that come through, but, back in Bach's day? Because there wasn't really such a need for it. But now with holes in the ozone, 5G, Fukushima, Chernobyl, we're exposed to so much more radiation, for example. So as there's a need in the society, an essence will come down to address that.
In homeopathy, and we have this practice of proving a substance, and you're sharing a little bit here about what this process is for identifying the plants, and that they're coming through, they're sort of landing with you. But how is it that the sort of discovery and development process works, in terms of, if you have an image of a flower or a plant land, what your next steps are then? And I'm wondering how much the environment, the fuller environment of the bush, the sun, the winds, the landscape in which the plant is growing are contributing to this process.
Yeah. And I don't grow any of the plants. I prefer to find them growing out in the wild, because there's some really harsh conditions that in the desert and the central areas of Australia, you've got a 25-year cycle where you'll have drought for like maybe 20 years. It's broken by heavy rain, so there's floods. Everything grows, then it dries out, and then about 4 years later, there's big bushfires go through and burn everything. So for the plants to survive environments like that, they've got to be strong and hardy, and so they're the ones that I'm drawn to working with. And you can have there was one called a green spider orchid, and it grows in the state below me in Victoria. And there'd been very bad bushfires, and there'd been no rain from January to October, so they didn't flower that year. But I found that same species of plant growing on the other side of the country, and I made the remedy there. But it didn't have one of the qualities. It has a fear of blood is one of the aspects. It's telepathic communication is its key one, but it has this thing of fear of blood. And the one in Western Australia didn't have that quality. So, just the environment where they're grown can certainly have an impact even on the same species of plants. And, I mentioned Edward Bach, which is probably close to your heritage as well. And he had two methods of preparing his remedies. He was very impatient. He originally started collecting the dew, but that was very slow. So he would pick the flowers under ideal conditions, place them in a bowl of water, and the sun would release that vibrational quality of the flower into the water. The other method was he was picking especially buds from trees and boiling them. Now in Australia, it's so much hotter, we don't need to do the boiling method. There's one plant I'd love to tell you a little bit later called boab. And when I made this up, that day, temperature-wise in Celsius, it was 47. So it's about 120 Fahrenheit, so you don't need to be boiling anything when you get that heat. So I've continued making the essences in a similar way that Dr. Bach did, but using that, what he called the sunshine methods, where the flowers are picked, you put them in a bowl of water, and the sun will release that quality. It takes in Australia, about an hour and a half. Bach found in England was about 4 hours. You then discard the flowers, and that water is added to brandy as a preservative, and that's the mother tincture. Now, in homeopathy, you can keep diluting down, thousands of times, but in flower essences, we just dilute 2 more times down from that original one. So when I've got that information about this plant has certain qualities and I've found the plant, then I would be, collecting the flowers, putting it in the bowl of water, provided there's sun on that particular day. And sometimes there's a real magic in that process, because you have to have a lot of reverence, but it's almost like an alchemic interaction between the plant kingdom, the human kingdom, but also the spiritual kingdom. And I find that animals are very drawn to when that process is happening. There's a workshop I teach where, as a group, we all make up an essence. And I did that in Bournemouth, down the south of England one time, and it was in an orchid reserve, and there were wild horses there. So, we've got, when the bowls were left out, we had the stallion running up and down in front of them, and all the female horses coming in. And, in Ireland, we've done this, and there's been donkeys, wild donkeys there. In Australia, you usually get monitor lizards, about, 4 feet lizards coming out, and eagles or something. So the animals pick up, and you go to that same spot the next day, and it's got a nice feel, but it's not that supercharged as when an essence is being made, because you're getting all that spiritual beings present there as well. And once I found the location, I got my flowers, I picked them, put them in the bowl, and then that's how we get that original concentrate. And I said, I don't grow them. I go out to all different parts of Australia to prepare that.
A brief pause to thank you for listening to this episode. If you're looking to take the next step in your transformation, find out how we can support you with our popular energy healing training, one-to-one private sessions, free resources, and more. Visit energyfielddynamics.com to learn more. You mentioned boab there for a moment and said you'd like to talk about that. Actually, Crystal and I have experience working with it from your line, and we found it to be a really powerful, really wonderful essence to work with. Would you talk a little bit about that? You were going to say something about it, so I'll just open it up to you.
Yeah, and then I'd love to hear your experiences with it as well after. So It's probably the most dominant tree in the northwest of the country. It's quite spectacular. You could have 10 people with their arms stretched out, and you'd still probably wouldn't fit around the circumference of some of these trees. And they can grow well over 1,000 years old, these trees, but they don't branch till they get to the very top. So getting up the top is a little hard. But traditionally, the Aboriginal women, if they were in that area and they were going into labor, and it was in flower, which is December through to about February, someone in the tribe would attempt to collect the flowers. The woman who would be given it, she'd go off by herself, dig a hole, line it with the boab flowers, squat, and deliver the baby into that boab-lined hole. And their understanding was it helps clear the negative patterns which come down generationally. So we could think of, oh, sure, like if you have a parent who's, say, an alcoholic, then there's a high chance that addictive personality will come through with the children. Or if one of the parents is very fearful and anxious, that anxiety is likely to be picked up by the children, for example. What I found is that, it's clearing from a homeopathic point of view. It's also clearing the miasms. And for the homeopaths, we have tubercular, psychotic, luetic, all those different miasms. And it's unusual to have a remedy, either homeopathic or fluorescence, which can work across all the miasms. And we have a number of people writing in of the Herring's law, the reverse order from when symptoms you have being cleared and traveling from down the bottom of the body up. So it's a really very deep acting one. And we have a lot of women, when they've birthed, that they will put some of the boab on the nipple, so the baby's getting colostrum, but they're also getting the boab to help clear it, or they'll be taking the essences to help clear through some of those patterns. But it's not just the emotional patterns, also physical ones. We had a good friend of mine. She was in New Orleans, and her mum had a cleft palate. She had a cleft palate. She had 3 daughters, and 2 of them were born with a cleft palate. And the oldest one was having surgery to help repair that. And she was given the wrong anesthetic and died on the operating table. So Arlene said that her youngest daughter, who was only 4 at the time, she said, I've been giving my daughter Grace boab twice a year. And I really wanted, if she grows up and decides to have a child, by working with the boab, that her children won't be born with a cleft palate. But it's a very powerful one. We said addictive personalities, that insecurity, all those different patterns. And usually families will have a certain pattern coming through them, unique to that family. And it's, I think now's the time the buck stops here. We take responsibility for stopping it ourselves, but also down that family line. And boab is a great remedy for doing that. And I think some of the deepest healings that I've seen have, certainly come with boab.
Thank you, Ian. From our perspective, we came across that particular essence when we were ourselves looking at ancestral healing. And speaking for myself, I used it alongside a decent amount of family constellations work when I was touching base with different family fields and seeing how that reflected and refracted through my own field and system. And the word that you used there was incredibly deep, or the phrase, and that would be my understanding of it from a sort of ESP perceptual sense. It was working incredibly deeply through the system. I've worked with vibrational essences for many years since childhood. And for me, it was one of the standout remedies in terms of that feeling incredibly involved through the system. And I was very conscious when I was working with it. That wasn't something I would take too lightly. Some of the essences I'll use more, to support ongoing practices, but that was a very focused meditation piece if I was going to make use of the boab.
We actually have a number of people who run family constellation, and they'll spray boab around the room before everyone comes in. For me, the one of the beauties of flower essences, they're so adaptable. You can be an acupuncturist and you can put the essences on the needle. You can be working as a herbalist. You can give the essences. You can be using as a doctor. Like, it's no matter, you can do Reiki and put it on your palms and beam it out. Like, it really fits in so well with other modalities.
You mentioned Boab there, and this might be a little bit of an unfair question, but I can't but help ask. Is there a desert island bush remedy for you? And by that, I mean, a sort of single takeaway remedy, or maybe like asking you to choose a favorite child. Perhaps there's a couple that sort of stand out, but I think it's, really helpful for our audience to hear you talking about a few of the ones that stand out to you.
Look, to see waratahs growing in the wild is so spectacular, and it's a beautiful bin. It's like that. It's deep red. It's the logo for my company, because it's such a deep one. Deep acting remedy. We organised the 3rd International Flower Essence Conference in Sydney. It was back in 1992. First one was in France, second one was in Canada. And we had a number of speakers come in. There was Eric Pelham, who was the chief blender of Aura-Soma at the time. And Eric came, and his talk was on the Davic realm. And he said within the Davic realm, there were 5 master flowers. And Waratah was one of them, that he said. And it was the only flower the Aborigines gave to the white settlers because it was their highest flower. And certainly, my experience, first time I got information about it was right near the end of the flowering season. And we have inland from Sydney, about 2 hours inland, there's a mountain range, and it's a bit of a cooler climate. So some of the flowers on the coast, when they're finished, they can still be found in flower there. And I got the information about the Waratah, and, for deep or dark nights of the soul, despair. And I thought, well, this is such an important remedy. And there was none left on the coastal areas where I live. And I got in touch with a botanist at one of the universities who specialised in Waratah. And he said, look, there's one area renowned for the last flowering Waratahs. And he passed on their details. And I contacted them. And because I came through this man, they said, yes, we're willing to tell you where they are. Because they used to collect them and sell them commercially. And they said, look, there'd been a papal tour, a few weeks earlier, and they said, we got the last of the Waratahs for that tour. You're welcome to go there, but there's none left. And I'm thinking, it's for me, where I lived, it was about nearly a 3-hour drive. And I looked at my schedule and was able to swap around a number of patients on one particular day. Then the weather forecast changed. It was supposed to be raining that day. And the night before, it was heavy rain. And I thought, looked at the forecast and was like, oh, very bad. And I went in my meditation that night and I saw a beautiful Waratah. I thought, oh, this is a good omen. Look, obviously a sign I'm supposed to go there. And it was raining the whole trip there, got out, heavy rain. I'm walking around and there were a lot of Waratahs. When you got closer, many of them had finished. They were starting to brown off in the leaves, or they just weren't in perfect state. But it was nice wandering around. And then, went down into a gully, and by a creek, there was this beautiful, perfect Waratah. And as I just sort of stopped there, suddenly the rain stopped around me, maybe 20 meters away, 60 feet. The rain was still coming down. I thought, this is weird. Anyway, I had all my gear and I sort of sat down and pulled it out. And I'm thinking, it's going to heavy rain in a moment. And then a shaft of sunlight came down just over about a 9-foot, 3-meter radius around the Waratah. So, I collected flour, put it in the bowl, and it stayed in that shaft of sunlight for the exact time. It was an hour and 3/4. There's a point where the flower goes limp, the energy's transferred. And at that point, I'm starting to lift the Waratah out. Suddenly the sky went black and it started raining and hail came down. It was almost like Spirit said, okay, you got, hour and 3/4 now, and pulled it. And it was just like, that magic happens so often in making the essences. It's so the Waratah is very special. And there's a tiny little flower called fringed violet. It's on a grass stem. And, Waratah's this big thing like that. And fringed violet's like this. And to that lovely expression, gobsmacked. You see it in the bush and you're mesmerized. And it's working, healing breaks holes in the aura. It's releasing shock from the body. It's a beautiful, powerful flower. And that would be a second one. And I think the third one is the Sturt Desert Pea, which grows in the desert, and it's for grief and sadness. And it's commonly found on the salt plains and salt lakes. And for the indigenous people, they say the salt lakes were formed by all the tears of humans falling over the centuries. And that's where you find this flower. And I think the first time I saw it, I couldn't move. I was just gazing at it for half an hour. So
how would you say you could like characterize the qualities of the bush flowers and plant life in comparison to maybe European or North American lands or places where you're familiar with the qualities of the energies of the plants? Is there something that typifies or characterizes the specific region or continent you're working on?
when I run workshops in North America or Europe, I think a lot of I'll have slides of the essences I'm talking about and the locations where they grow. But for a lot of people, they really notice that they look very ancient. And if we go back, 30 million years ago, we had two major land masses, Eurasia in the north and Gondwanaland in the south. And Gondwanaland was made up of Africa, South America, Australia, Antarctica. And 30 million years ago, they started separating. And Australia was the last one to separate from Antarctica. And being an island, it was a natural barrier. So the plants growing up, there wasn't like a dominating species coming in and taking over. So there's that ancientness. And Australia has the highest number of flowering plants in the world. And the geologists say we had the first erosion, which created the first soil. So we had the first plants. And so there's something a little bit unique. And I know that the Australian bush flower essences have got a reputation for working very quickly and very deeply. And I think it's that potency of the land. And sometimes in Europe, I've taught in France and Germany, and there'll be places where, a few kilometers away in the First or Second World War, you had thousands of people killed violently. And energetically, it still leaves an overlay. Like you go those places and it doesn't feel so nice. And, Australia had a very small number of Indigenous people, maybe 250,000, quite peaceful, harmonious, as opposed to maybe Pacific Islanders, a bit more yang and warriors and, a lot more wars and battles. So, energetically on the land, it's quite a pristine environment, both physically, but also spiritually and psychically as well. And I think all these factors lead to the potency of the plants coming through. Yeah. And in fact, I mentioned the fringe violet. One of the things I do is numerology, and I've studied at the same time I was doing my naturopathy. And every person's chart that I work with, I do their numerology. And people being born this millennium have all got at least 1, 2 in their birth date. And 2 is a lot to do with sensitivity. It's also intuition as well. But you're finding unusual patterns where, children are having 3 or 4 2s in the birth date. Like they're super sensitive. They're very picking up other people's feelings. They go into a classroom and one of the children is sad, so they'll start feeling sad. Or environmental things will impact them more. So I think that fringe violet is a really nice one for protecting you from not taking on too much from other people or the environment, for example.
You must have seen an incredible number of case studies, as it were, over the years, just many people making use of these remedies, not just clients, but practitioners as well, those working with them. I'd love for you to share if there's anything particular that stands out in terms of feedback and case studies of how these essences are powerfully sort of influencing. We've spoken a little bit about how they're suitable for sort of a lot of different types of people for a lot of different issues. But how is it that if somebody was looking to incorporate essences into their life, is it really covering sort of all sorts of different emotional issues or physical symptoms? And what might people expect to see in terms of results?
Well, they certainly have a very broad spectrum in their application. So we have a tree called Old Man Banksia. That's its common name. And Captain James Cook, he came to Australia in 1770. They collected a lot of botanic samples. Joseph Banks, the botanist, was collecting all the plants, taken back to Kew Gardens in England, and they did some studies on it. And the tree is very slow growing, rough old bark, and they called it Old Man Banksia. Yet for the Aborigines, it was a tree for female spirituality. And one of the qualities of Old Man Banksia, it's working on the thyroid. And you'll find that in Western countries, about 40% of women over 40 have underactive thyroids. So you can see how, vitally important it was. And, I will have numerous case histories of people, especially women, being on thyroxine for underactive thyroids. They're putting on weight. They're mentally not as sharp as what they normally used to be. Skin's getting dry, hair brittle. And being able to come off the thyroxine and balancing the thyroid. So very physical ones. I mentioned Sturt Desert Pea. Probably one of the most spectacular cases I've had personally was this particular woman. She was very well known internationally, a major healer, running workshops. She came to see me for treatment, and she couldn't sit down. She was in so much pain. She was really crippled with rheumatoid arthritis. Her hands were all deformed, and some tremendous pain. And when we started talking, her husband had left her for another woman. They used to run the workshops together, and she was quite devastated. And I really thought that was a key factor in her physical symptoms, all the sadness she had. So I gave her the Sturt Desert Pea, and she rang back 4 days later. And she said, Ian, since taking this remedy, all I've done is cry. And, she wasn't saying it was a bad thing. And she said, the other thing is, and I can't believe it, that my pain has gone. And also the deformity in her hands had gone. And if you were to tell a rheumatologist rather, that you could do that in 4 days, they'd laugh at you. You're just, you're delusional. And again, if you get to the cause, how powerful symptoms can be. And we have bush fuchsia, which is a wonderful lessons for learning. And we have children who are not doing very well at school. They're looking like they're going to have to repeat mathematics like a foreign language they've got no idea about. And it just integrates hemispheres of the brain, clears dyslexia, and suddenly they realize, oh, I understand it. I'm not stupid. And they start to enjoy learning. And just to see that transformation in children, because a lot of other kids will start teasing them, and they start to feel that they're stupid because they're not learning or they don't understand things as well as the other children. To see that transformation is wonderful. We have, my wife's the harpist for the opera, and sometimes she'll be, there'll be a 15-minute break, and then she's got to come in and make sure he doesn't make a mistake. Her fingers are getting cold, slowing down. So she'll take the bush fuchsia for coordination and what have you for that moment. Have artists who are going through creative block who can, take a remedy, turkey bush, which helps clear the inner critic to saying, well, that's not very good, but also allows you to bring through that creative energy. Essences for self-esteem. Fringe violet, releasing shock. I had one woman, she was 23, and they call it the golden 5 minutes. You've spent 55 minutes, you're wrapping up your session with them, and they come out with a clanger. And hers was, oh, by the way, I've got cancer of the cervix. I'm going to have surgery in 3 weeks. Is there anything you would suggest for this? And you go, oh, why don't you tell me that beginning of the session? And then, talking about, the background, it turned out that she was sodomized against her will when she was 15 by her boyfriend at the time. And she'd never felt comfortable with physical intimacy after that point. And just that location where she's getting a cancer, you probably think there's something related to sexuality. So we gave the essences wisteria, flannel flower, fringe violet. And she said, when I started taking it, I had this burning in the cervix. It was very intense, but it felt good. It felt like it was good pain. she went back to the gynecologist 2 weeks after that, and they did just a preoperative check, and they couldn't find any cancer. Like, again, that thing of when you get cause of the problem, how quickly the body has the ability to heal itself. So I'll have essences working on self-esteem, and I think everybody on the planet's been in a period of their life where they haven't felt good about themselves, or the self-confidence has been low. So, it's really so many areas we can use the essences. And for me, the beauty is you can have parents, they've got no training in medicine or naturopathy, but they recognize, our pet cat died and the children are very upset. You can give the remedy for that sadness and grief. Or, our son didn't get invited to the birthday party and everyone else in the class did. So dealing with that rejection, you don't have to be a psychologist or psychiatrist or to recognize those basic emotional states. So my goal was always for having the essences in every home so children will get brought up with them. And, like occasionally I'll ask in a workshop, how many people had flower essences when they're growing up? I'm like, it's very rare that you have someone, maybe a little bit better now, but if they're a younger person. And then I say, think of all the things you went through as a child. How much easier would it have been if your parents knew about flower essences to help with all those things? So,
what would you say is a big myth or misconception about flower essences that you find coming up being a practitioner and educator?
I think the biggest problem is people not knowing what it is. Or thinking it might be, they've got the bottle and they think it's an essential oil and wanting to smell it. Or, some people think, oh, they don't work. They're very, very gentle. They don't really do very much. I think, it's really nice when these people get a bit of a shock. And what you were talking about for case histories, we have 2 of our staff who are monitoring the case histories, the testimonials being sent into us. So we list them by the essence, but also by the condition that's treated. So, if we have someone doing some research, I say, oh, what have you got for this, dealing with this particular aspect? And then we can, got the results, or we can share that with we have teachers around the world in other countries, so we can give them, the testimonials they can use in their classes. We put a lot of emails out once a month. I'll do an update, and then also once a month we'll do a video on the flowers and we'll add case histories for it. So we're sharing that information, the case histories, and very grateful for people taking the time to write in their experiences.
There's over 70 essences, I believe, now in the repertoire of Australian bush essences. I wonder what the future was as you saw it. Is it building the library? Is it continuing to promote and spread the word? What's your intentions for your role in helping to? I mean, as you're describing it to me, it sounds very much like you see yourself in service to sharing these plants and this gift, effectively, of the plants. So I just wondered what your intentions and ambitions are for the future.
Well, I think you put your finger very much on it. It's just really, for me, is to sort of spread that information so people can be aware of it and start to use them. And, it's nice where we've got things like AI coming in. Like I was teaching in Romania for the first time this year. So we did a little promo, and we can use AI to have me speaking fluent Romanian with a slight Australian accent talking about it. So again, the communication, rather than having subtitles, we got, during COVID, we built a recording studio. So we did all the workshops online, and we've got this library of the workshops. We've been doing subtitles underneath it, but now even in this last 6 months, the prices have reduced. So there's that option of being able to put them, me speaking fluent Italian or whatever in the workshop. So that's quite exciting how that makes it a little bit easier to spread the work around there.
As a kind of final question before we wrap things up, do you have a particular self-practice? What do you do to find your balance, your center, your continued inner work, etc.? Do you have anything that you like to do, or anything you'd want to share about that?
Look, I think one of the most important things anyone can do is to have their own spiritual meditative practice, that quietness. So I think, when I came back a bit of a physical mess from traveling in India, meditation was one of the things I do. And there's a flower called Black-Eyed Susan. Someone's impatient, doing lots of things, overcommitting themselves, poor time management. I think that would be my constitutional remedy. And I shudder to think what I'd be like now, even if I'm still alive, if I hadn't have done meditation in my life. Like it just keeps things in balance, but also it gets your guidance come through. Like you just sit in that quiet and you go, oh, okay, yeah. Or thinking about doing a book and boom, you'll get it channeled through. Just do this. It saves you so much time. And then I think, for everyone, I highly recommend, doing a daily meditation practice. And then having that connection to the spirit realm as well. On the physical level, and I'm looking down at the ocean below me, I love body surfing. And, I go in most days, and there's a group where I live, my beach, Avalon, and, it's a real community of body surfers. And, we'll have about 20 body surfers. Every morning, there's probably at least 5 of us out there body surfing. And, 3 of the men are in their 80s, quite a lot in the 70s. I'm one of the young whippersnappers in my late 60s. It's also nice because a lot of my work, it's women. The workshops, it's 95% women. Used to be 90%. It's got even less now. And in my, we have 20 staff, and I think there's, there's 3 men. So my world is a lot of women around. So this is the area where I have a lot of a male environment, which is really quite nice. And today the surf's about 6 foot. It's quite wild, and just knowing that and being in that environment where you feel a bit testy, you've got to be careful, but yeah, and you get amazing waves. So that's the other thing I love doing.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that passion. I can feel in the way you're sharing about it how relevant that is to you. Before we close, I'd love to ask you to share any information for people who might be looking to locate more information about the essences or any of the workshops, etc., that you offer. Where is it that people can find a little bit more info?
You can go to our website, which is ausflowers, ausflowers.com.au. And so there's videos on the flowers. There's a lot of information about them. They can find access to all the workshops. And, we have distributors in other countries on the website. You can find, distributors in your own country. We have Southern Herbs in the United States, Living Planet in England, for example. So, and get them directly from us, or you'll find a distributor in your own country.
Beautiful. We'll make sure the website's included of course, in the show notes.
Thank you so much today for speaking with us. It's been really enriching and inspiring, and, taking the time to share your wisdom with all of our listeners and with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, I really enjoyed speaking to you both. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity of spreading the information about what the essences can do.
Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.